Paris Perspective.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Paris Perspective with me, David Coffey. The poor handling of the AUKUS submarine deal last summer left France clutching at straws when it came to asserting its presence in the Indo-Pacific region. China has called the US, UK, Australia Security Pact irresponsible, and France has been making overtures to the other regional powers, such as Indonesia and Vietnam, to push for more influence in its former colonial neighbourhood. Now, today I'm joined in studio by Antoine Bondaz, who's Research Fellow at the Foundation for Strategic Research here in Paris. Antoine, it's great to have you on the programme today.
Thank you very much.
OK, we're going to dive straight in. What exactly is France's strategy in the Indo-Pacific now that the AUKUS deal has left relations with traditional allies in a very poor state?
So maybe before discussing the French strategy in the Indo-Pacific, I think it's very important to remind everyone about the French interest in the region. France is not an observer in the Indo-Pacific. France is a resident power in the Indo-Pacific. We have more than 1.7 million French people living on French overseas territories from Reunion Island to French Polynesia. It's more than 92% of the spatial economic zone and maritime domain of France, and we have more than 7,000 soldiers permanently deployed in the region. So that makes actually the Indo-Pacific an issue of sovereignty interest, not only on business or cultural interest, etc. So France decided to lay out its Indo-Pacific strategy a few years ago, in 2018 actually, when President Macron visited in May 2018 Australia. And that strategy initially was very security and defense focused. And it explained why the Ministry of Armed Forces in 2019 was the first ministry to actually release its own Indo-Pacific strategy. It was a security strategy. In 2019, 2020, the strategy was diversified to include, of course, much more business interests, cultural interests, global interests, etc. And the new strategy was updated and presented in July 2021, so this year, focusing much more on the trade relations we have with the countries in the regions, with the global stakes in the region, including the need to address the fight and the mitigation of climate change, etc. Does the AUKUS deal put into question the world strategy? No. It forces France, to be clear, to recalibrate. Australia was actually one of the three key strategic partners of France in the region, along India and Japan. Australia is no longer a strategic partner on that, to be very clear, and the relations have deteriorated to an all-time low, I would say, and it's not going to change in the foreseeable future, at least in the coming weeks or coming months. So it brings actually the necessity on the French side to recalibrate, to reach out to other Indo-Pacific countries, including Indonesia, including Korea, something actually that some of it had been advocated for quite a few years. So I would say it's something good in disguise, the idea that it forced us, actually the AUKUS deal, to rethink a little bit our strategy. But to be clear, once again, our interests remain in change in the region. So we're not going to leave the Indo-Pacific. We're still going to keep the Indo-Pacific strategy, but it's going to evolve a little bit.
Involving that evolution, the importance of New Caledonia in the region now obviously seems to have increased tenfold over the last 10 years. And of course, we have referenda coming up, etc. So how important is New Caledonia to France? Has it always been there, or is it now really coming to a new level of importance?
I think it has always been very important. We need to get back, of course, to history, especially in the 1980s, when we had like very violent demonstration and huge tensions in the islands. Then with the Noumea Agreement of 1988 and the decision to hold in the longer term.
98, wasn't it?
Yeah, 98.
98, yeah.
In the longer term to hold so the three referendums, and we're going to have the third one in the coming days. What is quite important for France is two things, I think. To remind that we are following a very democratic process, that there is this consultation, this referendum, and the population in New Caledonia can express itself and decide on their own future. But New Caledonia so far is still part of France, still part of the French Republic. It's one territory like the others, I would say, is not in a subcategory of anything. And it will be very, very important in the coming weeks, actually, after the referendum, to make sure that we don't have a new peak in terms of violence, in terms of tensions in the islands, because the independentist associations have called actually a boycott for the referendum. So we need to make sure that even though the result of the referendum won't be recognized by some of the people in New Caledonia, we can move forward, find maybe a new agreement, kind of, and make sure at least that the situation remains as stable as possible in New Caledonia.
And now looking, let's just say, with the relationship between Paris and Beijing, am I right in saying that France has been running with the hare and chasing with the hounds when it comes to dealing with China? Like Paris, especially over the last year with Macron maybe taking a firmer stance with China about human rights issues, Uyghurs, etc. But at the end of the day, Paris also needs to cooperate with Beijing because of the Paris Climate Accord, about biodiversity, about the reforms of the World Trade Organization. So how are direct relations, or what is the how do our direct relations, how do they stand between Beijing and Paris at the moment?
So some might call it ambiguous.
Yeah.
The French diplomats would call it like tri-dimensional. The idea that from the European view, China is both a cooperation partner, an economic competitor, and a systemic rival. It means that we are fully aware that we have to cooperate with Beijing on many issues, from climate change to preventing the next pandemic, etc. And at the same time, China is for sure a competitor and more a rival in terms of norms, in terms of systems of governance, etc. And we've seen it over the last few months. So it's quite complicated for Paris, like any other EU member state, to balance, I would say, its relationship with Beijing. President Macron, starting in 2017, had two priorities. The first one was to rebalance the economic relations with China that are very unbalanced, with a huge trade deficit. And on that dimension, I would say that the results we've achieved are very, very limited. Mm-hmm. So the beef embargo was lifted, but there has been no rebalance, I would say, of trade flows between the two countries. The second dimension was climate change. Mm-hmm. Some might say that thanks to France, China stayed in the Paris Agreement, the COP21 agreement. I think we need to make sure that if China stayed in the agreement, it's not because of France, it's because of the US. That because the US left under the Trump administration, China had even more interest in staying within the Paris Agreement. So let's say that the results of the France-China relation, of the French-China's policy, has been quite mixed and a little bit disappointing. Yeah. The key question we have now, and especially in the coming month with the French presidency, is how at the EU level relations unfold with Beijing in a sequence in which there is a deterioration of the relation between Brussels and Beijing, between the capital cities, the capitals, and Beijing. We've seen it on trade and investment, with the comprehensive agreement on investment that is now frozen. We are seeing it now with China trying to economically coerce Lithuania over the question of Taiwan. We've seen it on many aspects. And the key question is, how do we manage the deterioration of the relation, because it's going to keep deteriorating?
Indeed, that does bring me to my next question, specifically Xi Jinping's signature Belt and Road Initiative that you mentioned there, or you alluded to there. It's drawing in Eastern European countries that are becoming a key part to this economic superhighway that Beijing really expects to evolve over the coming years. But Brussels, of course, then also has its aims to give a counter proposal and a counter kind of a European similar trade corridor further down the line. So can we expect a showdown between European partners and China over this expansion of the Belt and Road into European traditional spheres of influence?
I think there are two main trends these days. The first one is a deterioration of relations, especially between Eastern European countries and China. We've seen it with Lithuania, of course, but more broadly about like almost all of these countries, maybe with the exception of Hungary. What's happening is basically that Eastern European countries are refocusing their foreign policy on the US, also in connection with what they perceive as a Russian threat. So they are actually not investing as much as before politically on China. It explains why the 17+1, the special discussion formats, including 17 European countries, not only from the EU, but also Ukraine, Belarus, etc., is basically weakened these days, with Lithuania that has left. Czech Republic might leave actually in the coming weeks, etc. So deterioration of relation between Eastern Europe and China. The second trend is the EU is willing to compete much more with China, especially on connectivity, basically on building infrastructures.
Yeah.
The Belt and Road Initiative is not only about infrastructures, even though it was seen for long as one of the key elements. On that, we need to be very clear. The EU remains by far the largest provider of overseas development aid in the world, the largest. And most of the time it's subsidies, it's not loans. So in Africa, in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, the EU is doing a lot, and the EU is expecting to do even more. That's why a few days ago, the EU Commission accepted to start a new project called Global Gateway. Global Gateway will be funded with more than 300 billion euros, with one key objective: improve connectivity. That means building infrastructures around Europe, but also in Southeast Asia, in Africa, etc., to make sure that these countries have the opportunity and the choice between some infrastructures built with Chinese money when they have then to pay back, and it's that most of the deals are not being very transparent, or some EU money in much more transparent, much more higher quality infrastructure. And then, once again, what is important for the European perspective is to offer the alternative, the choice to these emerging countries.
Now, if correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think with viewing China and especially its development and economic into an economic powerhouse since the 1980s, a lot of that success was built on soft power. Also, one of the main issues was no direct foreign military interventions, apart from the occasional spat with India on the border there in the Himalayas. But China's non-interventionist policy, however, is one of the keys to its success. But could this change? I mean, is mainland Chinese intervention in Taiwan a viable scenario here? I mean, we are seeing a build-up in the Indo-Pacific. Taiwan is being used as a pawn, and it's an issue of sovereignty for the mainland Chinese. Can we see are people scared that there could be a military
I think there
intervention?
are two things. The first one is in terms of military intervention worldwide. Is China in the coming years going to military intervene like the US or like some European countries, including France, have been intervening over the last few years? We have no indication of that. We know that, of course, China built its first overseas base, military base in Djibouti in 2017. There might be other to come, including in Africa or in Southeast Asia. But so far, China is unwilling to intervene militarily abroad. Question of Taiwan, of course, is a little bit different between China, consider Beijing, consider Taiwan as being part of the People's Republic of China. This is what they call the One China principle. It's very different from the One China policy that we Europeans, Americans or Japanese implement. The One China policy is just that we consider that you have diplomatic relations either with Beijing or with Taipei, and we all have, all of us, the Europeans, diplomatic relation with Beijing, and we do not intend to change that One China policy. But what is very concerning is, of course, the rise of tensions in the Taiwan Straits, that China flexing up its muscles, especially its military muscles.
How does that manifest itself? I mean, we have got geostrategists who always say, oh, well, commentators refer to China's assertiveness and aggression directed towards potential Western partners. But how exactly can...
I would say there is some structural aspect. Of course, Chinese military expenditures have increased eightfold in 20 years, when the Taiwan military expenditures stagnated over the same period of time. So the balance of power is shifting in favor of Beijing, of course, in the Taiwan Strait. Second, China is much more assertive in terms of displaying its military power. And we've seen it over the last few months, few weeks, with China sending its military airplane into what we call the Taiwan's aerial defense identification zone. This is not the airspace of Taiwan, but this is at least a zone in which the Chinese military plane did not go before and are now going. The objective, of course, is to put pressure on Taiwan to test Taiwan air defense, etc. So what we need to be clear that is a conflict likely in the coming month or coming years. I'm not quite sure. I don't think so. But what is important is to make sure that we Europeans, we have a role to play in preventing a conflict. It's not when there will be a conflict, and I hope it will never happen, that the Europeans will be able to do anything. The Europeans have a key role to play, and it's a role that they can play now in preventing a conflict, in making sure that China fully understands that the costs of initiating a military conflict with Taiwan would be too high.
And just to end our conversation, it was something that you touched on there, especially with China setting up its base in Djibouti. Recently, there was an Africa-China summit that was hosted by Senegal in Dakar. And Senegal's foreign minister openly called for Beijing to get involved in the fight against jihadists in the Sahel. Of course, the Sahel would have been traditionally very much a French-controlled region. But now we have the arrival of the Wagner Russian mercenaries in the Central African Republic and elsewhere. Will the Chinese take up the call to get involved in the G5 or within the Sahel fight against jihadists?
I don't believe so. China is de facto doing counter-terrorism operation outside of its border, including in Central Asia, and we've seen it in de facto Afghanistan or more broadly in Central Asia. Will China intervene in Sahel to help the local countries in fighting a jihadist group? I don't believe so. What is sure is that China is trying to protect its overseas citizens, that China is using for that not the People Liberation Army, but most of the time private military security companies, and that it may remain actually so in the foreseeable future, but I don't really see actually China sending special forces, the PLA, as far as of Africa to fight against terrorists.
Okay, Antoine Bondaz, Research Fellow at the Foundation for Strategic Research here in Paris. Thank you very much for being on Paris Perspective today. And thank you for watching. We'll be back in the new year for the next edition of Paris Perspective with me, David Coffey.